BookTube, it's Mike from Riffraff's Reading Renaissance. Today I'm doing a tag, and it's called The Perfection of Reading. The tag was originally done by Lekden at Reading from the Depths, and I was tagged by Pat from Book Chat with Pat. So thanks for the tag, Pat, and thanks Lekden for creating an interesting tag to do. In the original, Lekden says of the tag, the Tibetan Buddhist instruction to live a meaningful life is to try to live the life totally dedicated to benefiting others. He talks of the 6 perfections, type of enlightened activity that make up the conduct which ordinary people are encouraged to try and realize in their own lives. So the original book tag is celebrating those 6 perfections and how they affect our reading and what books we can choose to reflect those tags. So if I start with the first one, the perfection of generosity. The tag says, an experience of book gifting or receiving, meaningful or memorable to you. Here I want to tell a story that relates to War and Peace. As you probably know from my channel, I read War and Peace, which was one of the big achievements that actually got me to start on BookTube. But in sharing the story of how I read War and Peace and the approach I took to it and what I got out of it with a work colleague who's not a reader, I felt that I saw a spark of potentially a future reader. When I originally read War and Peace, I treated myself to this deluxe copy, and I'm glad I did because it's absolutely beautiful. But along the way, I had also picked up this slightly more economic Wordsworth Classic Edition. And it's a long story, but I'd ended up with 2 copies of the Wordsworth Classic Edition. So when chatting to my friend about War and Peace, and when I thought I saw something that I would describe as perhaps an interest that might take a little while to come to fruition, I decided to gift my spare copy to this friend with absolutely no pressure. I just said, take this, stick it on your bookcase, and if it's ever the right time, it's there. So that is my experience of book gifting. I haven't yet seen where it goes, but it's perhaps one of the more meaningful book gifts that I've given, in the vein of planting a seed, perhaps. The second perfection talks about ethical discipline, and it asks, what are the best and worst reading habits? I guess my best habit is the commitment I make to a book when I read it. Again, if I'm allowed to use War and Peace as an example, it's a huge book, and the reason it doesn't get read by most people is that it's too daunting. I took a different approach. I said I will read 25 pages a day, and I just accept that this book and I are going to be friends for quite some months. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. I read the 1,244 pages in 44 days. And I conquered the book. So that commitment to, once I decide to read a book, I will read the book. I will get through it and hopefully have an enriching journey doing so. And that's got me through, so far, not just War and Peace, but indeed the Brothers Karamazov, Middlemarch, Crime and Punishment, and Anna Karenina, all in relatively short form. So I'm greatly encouraged by that approach to reading, that I don't see the big book, see meaningful chapters and sizes that are realistic in one's life, and you'll get there in the end. So that's perhaps my best aspect of reading, is that once I decide I'm committed to a book, I will read it. My worst aspect, I guess, is perhaps what I describe as a slightly overactive brain that gets easily distracted when I'm considering the issues of the world around, and therefore I have to be quite disciplined about getting to reading and prioritizing reading. I'm not a doom scroller. I don't tend to spend an awful lot of time on my phone. I have the huge advantage of having grown up without phones, and therefore a phone to me is a useful gadget that tells me where I am when I'm lost and I need GPS. It tells me when I have to wake up in the morning, but it isn't something that I'm enslaved to. But I do find the fascination I have with everything around me in the world tends to distract from the calm and quiet that one needs to be an effective reader. So I have to be a bit disciplined about saying, have I done the reading that I undertook to do before the time has passed away? The third perfection that Lekden talks about is the perfection of patience. The question is, what is a book that you anxiously waited for, and did it live up to the expectations you set for it? Now, my answer here is a little bit complex, and it goes back to starting with those of you who've watched my channel loyally will know that A, I have a great love of music, and B, if push comes to shove, my number one favorite band of all the music that's out there is a progressive rock band called Jethro Tull, an English folk rock band called Jethro Tull. Now, Jethro Tull's first albums were released in the 1960s, 1968, 1969, and they've been producing albums ever since. So obviously those early albums are now coming up for their 50th anniversaries, and the music industry being what it is, they are releasing deluxe versions, but not only a deluxe version of the album, but in fact deluxe booklets. If I just stretch here, let me take an example. Perhaps I'll pick this one, which may be more familiar to some readers. This is Jethro Tull's album Aqualung, but not just inside here CDs which are remastered and remixed, and even in some cases some DVDs of concert performances in this deluxe package. But in fact in the middle is a 100-page booklet. Let me get this right for the camera. A 100-page booklet that goes into levels of detail that only a devoted fan would want, about the time that the band was living in, the making of the album. There's a chapter from the sound engineer about mixing the album. It is the ultimate anorex book for understanding the inner workings of the band and the album. And of course, in 1968 they released an album, and in 1969 they released another one, and so on and so on. So this series of 50th anniversary issues is in short succession. If I show you that, there's 1969. They just keep coming. They're literally issuing one a year, and these deluxe editions that are absolutely superb if you are a devoted fan like I am. But now there's a catch. These books are special editions, and if one doesn't order them when they're released in the UK, they rapidly go out of print, because there's a small print run, because it's a niche market, but a huge devotion of the fans that are fans of this band. And the way I've dealt with that is to say to my brother, who lives in England, that once a year I'm going to invest some money in these rather expensive deluxe books, have them shipped to you in England, and then whenever you decide to make a pilgrimage to avoid the harsh winters of Europe and come to stay with me in sunny South Africa, you can just bring a swag bag with you and offload when you get here. And therefore, that constitutes the excitement for me of the reissue, and reading all about it and watching everybody else unboxing theirs on YouTube, and knowing that mine is sitting safely with my brother in England and waiting very patiently for the next time he comes around, which tends to be around Christmas, because Christmas in Europe, of course, is a cold experience. Christmas in South Africa is a t-shirt, short pants, and casual shoes. It's a warm, sunny experience, and therefore it's a pleasant way to spend Christmas and catch up with his family out here. So that's my patience, is knowing that I've got these exciting books that I can't wait to get into and devour every last detail, but having to wait in some cases almost a full year to see them physically arrive. So that's my example of the books that reflect my attempts at patience. The fourth perfection is called the perfection of joyful effort. The question is, what is a book or series that you found difficult to complete but found to be ultimately worthwhile? Again, I'm tempted to go back to War and Peace, but in fact, I didn't find War and Peace difficult to complete. I've said before, War and Peace's chapters are short, and it's a little bit like watching a really good soap opera where you watch a little bit each day for a long period of time and you end up understanding the whole story. I think Moby Dick would be a better example. The book itself has been daunting because, in fact, the subject didn't appeal to me terribly much, but I kept hearing about what a foundational book it was, particularly in terms of American literature. And eventually, when I tackled it, I was quite pleased to find the quality of the writing was superb. I've got a whole video on my quest to conquer Moby Dick. So if you want to know more about that, I refer you to that. And ultimately, again, it was the experience of finding the book less intimidating than I had expected. And it feels like I'm now less uncomfortable with the concept of tackling really big books. Question 5 relates to the perfection of concentration. It says, what do you do to get in reading zone? What is your ideal reading environment? For me, to be honest, it's absolute silence, which probably means solitude, to gain access to what I call deep concentration. I like to read with a deep understanding of what I'm reading. I'm capable of great concentration, but the brain that I mentioned earlier that's a little bit easily distracted needs silence. It needs the absolute silence. And therefore, to be honest, if I find myself on my own, that's ideal. I battle to sit in airports with the noise, background noise, and the piped music and all that kind of thing. Though I battle to tune those things out in order to concentrate on reading. So absolute silence is my ideal environment for reading. The location doesn't really matter. It's the silence that allows me to get inside myself and concentrate that really makes the difference. A book to give an example of this deep concentration is perhaps this non-fiction book I read recently by Robert Sapolsky called Determined: Life Without Free Will. This is a really difficult book to get your head around. Not because of the writing. In fact, the writing is pretty accessible given the subject matter. Robert Sapolsky, let me read you some of the blurb on the back. It says here, a joy to read. Sapolsky is not only one of the world's most brilliant scientists, but also an immensely gifted writer who tells this important story with wit and compassion. With his usual frank and amusing style, Sapolsky argues that free will is an illusion. His stance is both hard to accept and hard to deny. His argument in a nutshell, and I probably don't know if I'll do it justice, but let me give it a go, is that all the scientific tests that have been done on the workings of the brain, and as we get better and better at actually monitoring what the activity that's happening in the brain, he argues that it suggests that when one takes an action, that action is triggered not by a conscious decision of the brain where it's applying things like free will or morality or any of those things. It is simply the brain reacting to learned experience in both positive and negative sense. For example, childhood trauma, any of those sort of triggers right from the womb till the second before the activity we're talking about, that the brain is amassing experience and learning from that experience, and that therefore your actions are determined, as in the title of the book, and not a result of applying free will. Now, it's one thing to try and get your head around the science of what he's saying, but sociologically, it's an even greater mind blow, because if you think about the fact that he might be right, and the fact that we as a society do not in fact have free will, and that we're all simply, if in a sense, robots reacting to our pre-programming through life experience, then are we in fact responsible for our actions? And therefore, a lot of the social justice systems that are applied, the legal systems that are applied, would start to collapse if in fact you cannot hold people responsible for their actions, because in fact there was no conscious choice to take those actions. They were simply a result of the impacts of a life lived upon the brain of the individual. Now, if that's not a complicated read, I don't know what is. I'm still not sure where I stand on Sapolsky's premise here. It was fascinating. I love books that hurt your brain a bit while they make you think hard. But I think this is the perfect book to explain what I mean by deep concentration, and for which I need absolute silence to try and get inside the thinking of the book. So that would be my example for the perfection of concentration. And number 6 is the perfection of wisdom. What is a book where you learn something, especially something unexpected, whether profound or mundane? Here I'm going to pick again a book that I have mentioned before, but I'm such a fan of it that I'm unashamedly going to use it as an example of acquiring some wisdom. The book is called Prisoners of Geography. It's by Tim Marshall, who's a BBC reporter. But the book is subtitled 10 Maps That Tell You Everything You Need to Know About Global Politics. The premise, you can see I've been through this book in some detail. The premise is that the fortunes of nations are determined to a much greater extent than perhaps we day to day realize by their physical geography, their location, and the layout of the land that they are. The argument is made, for example, that the United States was predestined to be a successful society because of the way its terrain was laid out, where its mountains were, and the fact that it had logistical advantages over other territories of the world. The book is divided up predictably into the sections of the world. There's a chapter on Russia, one on China, one on the United States, one on Europe, one on Africa, one on Middle East, one on India and Pakistan, then one on Korea and Japan, and one on Latin America, and finally the Arctic, which remains quite a contentious area of land. And throughout there's always beautiful maps provided so that you can really follow along with whatever the storyline is. The premises, I won't spoil the book for you, you really need to read it, but the premise is that the success or failure of a lot of countries and their politics are to a massive extent affected by their geographies. It goes, for example, in the Russia chapter, it looks behind what Putin's real motivations are in his land grabs in Ukraine. It's not simply about the premise we keep hearing about rebuilding the old USSR. There are geographical imperatives about where ports are and which ones freeze over in winter and things like that opened in, certainly for me, opened up an understanding of what's going on in the world. And goodness knows there's a lot of turbulence in the world at the moment, but I found this a fantastic read. It's a small book, it's 320 odd pages, and very well worth a read. Definitely made me a bit wiser after reading it than I was before. So that is the tag. Those are the questions. And I'd like to thank Pat for tagging me. And I'd also like to thank Lekden for creating a very interesting and slightly offbeat tag with questions that made one think a little bit deeply before simply launching into quick answers. So I hope you've enjoyed rambling with me through the thought processes about the 6 perfections. And I hope I will see you again soon. Let me not forget, if you enjoyed the journey with me, please do the like, subscribe, and all the other stuff that you see here that we're supposed to do. And I hope to see you again next time, BookTube. Thanks very much. Bye-bye now.